Account 1. My story begins in a church in Tijuana, a place where I spent much of my childhood, long before the events that are now remembered from the 1980s. I have vivid memories of the field between the church and the convent, where we were allowed to play soccer without many restrictions. The nuns, always welcoming, treated us with kindness and never denied us a glass of water when we asked. They truly had generous hearts. On one particular day, I kept playing alone for a while, delaying my return home as much as possible, where problems awaited me. That was when I noticed another boy nearby, also alone, patiently waiting while his parents talked to the priest. Time passed quickly, and before we knew it, night had fallen. We were exhausted, covered in dust, and we knew well that we shouldn't be there after sunset. I invited the boy to accompany me to the convent door, where we could always get water from the nuns. However, before we could even knock, the door opened. On the other side, a very elderly nun observed us with a serene gaze. Her clothing was different from the other nuns I knew, which made me wonder if she was the Mother Superior. We explained that we were thirsty, and she asked us to wait. A short time later, she returned with 2 clay pots filled with fresh water. Each sip was so refreshing that for a moment I wondered if it was holy water. After quenching our thirst, we returned the jars, and the nun closed the door. Inside, everything was immersed in darkness, a sign that at that hour the convent had already settled into silence. I decided to take advantage of the nuns' kindness once more and walked back to the convent door to ask for some water. I knocked lightly, but no one responded. I waited a few seconds and rang the bell again. The silence persisted. That was when I felt something strange, the sensation that I was no longer alone. Turning around, I saw a silhouette emerging from the dark field where we used to play. My heart pounded when I recognized who it was. The nun who always seemed angry, the one whose mere presence made me uneasy. With a firm and impatient voice, she asked what I was doing there, ringing the bell at such a late hour. I immediately responded that I only wanted some water. With the same sharp tone, she retorted that they could no longer fulfill requests at that hour, that all the nuns were already asleep, and that she was only there because she needed to finish some tasks. Still, she made a point of emphasizing that it was very inappropriate of me to show up so late and ring the bell. I hesitated for a moment, but then mentioned that a few days before, someone had answered me at that same hour and gave me water. The nun was already dismissing me, but she paused upon hearing this. Slowly, she opened the door a little more and asked suspiciously if I was telling the truth. I confirmed that I was. Her expression grew more serious, and she wanted to know who had attended to me. I then described the elderly nun and her attire. For a brief instant, a melancholic smile appeared on her face, and her eyes glistened as if holding back tears. But as quickly as it came, that expression vanished, replaced by the same stern look as before. With a firm voice, she said that no nun fitting that description lived there and that I should never ring the bell so late again. That was all I saw that night, but later I discovered that there was something very strange behind that encounter. At the time, several children who had played there at dusk had reported seeing the same nun, dressed differently from the others, watching them from the darkness. The story of the nun who appeared at dusk was already a well-known legend among those who frequented the church. That is why almost no one dared to remain in the field after sunset. However, among all the people I knew, only that boy, who saw her with me just once, and I had direct contact with her. We were the only ones to receive her water, drinking it without knowing who had truly offered it to us. Account 2. At the end of 2020, he passed away due to complications from COVID. It was a difficult time for all of us, marked by loss and uncertainty. But just as he had always lived on his own terms, he also chose how he would go. Instead of going to a hospital, where so many entered and never came out, in a time when even the bodies did not return to their families, he made his decision. He told his children they were going to the village, to his home. That house, which had been abandoned for so long, seemed as if it had been waiting for him to return. It was there that he spent his last days. It was there that he passed away. And it was there that we buried him. In the village he had always called home. While we were at the house, surrounded by the memories he had left behind, one of his stories came back to me. My grandfather always said that throughout his life he had only 2 encounters with the supernatural. But, according to him, those 2 moments were more than enough. The story dates back to his childhood, taking place just a few steps from the house where he would later live. The same house I knew. At that time, he lived in an adobe house, of which only faint marks remain on the ground today. If the village is small now, back then, it was even smaller, just a corridor of houses scattered across a vast dam, surrounded by mountains. When there was no work in the fields, his father would leave for the city where he worked in construction. It was during one of these seasons when his mother was left alone with him. Then, 7 years old, his older brother, 9, and the baby sister, barely a year old, that this story took place. The baby's name was Anastasio. From birth, he was extremely frail and sickly. His birth had been difficult, a struggle that nearly took both him and their mother to the grave. My grandfather recalled that he and his older brother had to wait to meet him because both their mother and the baby had to stay in the city hospital for a month. From then on, Anastasio was never strong. He was a fragile boy, always sick, always in need of care. My grandfather told us that one time when his father left for the city to work, they knew he would be gone for weeks. Before leaving, he knelt beside Anastasio, hugged him gently, and told him that he loved him, that he needed to be strong. Deep down, he knew the boy was unwell. With every goodbye, he carried the fear that, upon returning, he might not find his son alive. One afternoon, my grandfather was playing with his dog near the house when he saw something strange. His sister, who was in the yard, suddenly stopped what she was doing and ran inside, as if she had heard someone calling her. Shortly after, she peeked out the door, and instead of yelling or scolding as she usually did, she simply asked him to come inside as well. He didn't need an explanation. Small as he was, he already understood the meaning of that silence. He walked slowly, obediently, a heavy sadness settling in his chest. But the feeling wasn't just emotional. He felt it in his body, in his stomach, a pain that suddenly appeared, warning him that something terrible had happened. When he approached, a single glance was enough to understand. His sister's teary eyes said everything. Anastasio had died at 3:30 in the afternoon. There was nothing more to be done. Their mother had fed him, and then held him as they rested in the chair he loved so much, where the sunlight gently streamed through the window. For a while they remained like that, drifting off in the warmth of the afternoon. Then suddenly Anastasio let out a long sigh and was gone. His mother tried to wake him, called his name, but he no longer responded. There was no hospital in that village, not in the next one, not in the one after that. To inform Anastasio's father and notify the authorities, someone had to go to the city. But before any decision could be made, the children entered the room to see their brother one last time. To their surprise, their mother had already changed his clothes. Anastasio was neatly dressed, wearing the new outfit they had bought especially for his baptism. My grandfather was deeply sad, and the pain in his stomach persisted, as if his own body was mourning too. Their mother announced that she would walk to the next village, where in an hour a bus would depart for the city. If she hurried, she might catch it. As she spoke, my grandfather couldn't help but think about how much he missed their family's donkey. He loved that animal. It was the one that took them everywhere. But when Anastasio was born, they had to sell it. Before leaving, their mother gave them strict instructions. Take care of their brother. Do not leave the house for any reason. Do not tell anyone. She feared that people might come out of curiosity rather than true respect for their grief. So she insisted they were to watch over Anastasio until she returned with their father. They carefully covered Anastasio's body, and my grandfather and his sister sat at the entrance of the house, watching their mother disappear down the dry, dusty path where the pale earth looked rusted even without strong sunlight. Time dragged on. The first hour of waiting was agonizingly slow. They wandered through the house like shadows, avoiding looking at the bed, though their eyes kept drifting toward the blanket-covered form. Every time they did, the pain in my grandfather's stomach intensified. The absence of Anastasio was a tangible emptiness, and the memory of his cries, the same cries that used to annoy the dog but never provoked a bite, for it was a gentle dog, echoed through the house like a ghost. Night fell, and then they heard it, a baby's cry, from far away. The two siblings looked at each other, tense. They peeked out the door, but there was nothing. The closest houses were so far away that only the first was visible. There, a single weak window light flickered in the darkness. Maybe the wind had carried the sound from somewhere distant, but there was one unsettling detail. There were no babies in the village, at least none that they could recall. The dog perked its ears and walked toward the sound, sniffing as if sensing something unseen. Then they heard it again, and again. A knock at the door. "Who's there?" they asked. "I came to see the boy," a distant hoarse voice answered. "For what? Who sent you?" "I came to see the boy," the voice repeated, emotionless. Looking through the window, they saw a figure draped in a dark habit. But the face was hidden. The voice returned, more insistent. "I came to see the boy." The door shook. The latch rattled. "Go away!" my grandfather's sister shouted. "I will return! I will return!" And then, silence. By morning, the nightmare was over. But when my grandfather looked at the door, he noticed something. A bullet hole. The neighbor who had helped them stood pale, eyes hollow. That day, they buried Anastasio. Lacking money for a coffin, they covered his grave with heavy stones, just to make sure nothing would disturb it. My grandfather returned every week, just to make sure. His sister never spoke of that night. 4 years later, she died. And when, decades later, my grandfather learned he would not survive COVID, he returned to the village, perhaps to see her, perhaps to see Anastasio, or perhaps to check one last time that the grave was still untouched. Account 3. A place that today is nothing more than ruins, lost among dirt roads a little over an hour from Leon. Since childhood, they had heard stories about an abandoned convent, an ancient structure that stood alone at the top of a hill. It was said that in the past, the convent had been inhabited by Clarice nuns, but over the years, its function changed into something mysterious, something secretive. It still belonged to the church, but no one knew exactly for what purpose. What people whispered was that when someone in the village fell gravely ill, with no hope of a cure, they were taken there. The reason? A miraculous image that, according to the rumors, had performed inexplicable healings. When my parents were teenagers, a great scandal shook the village. 2 men appeared in the middle of the square, crying and begging for forgiveness. They were thieves, known for petty thefts, but nothing compared to the state of despair they were in. They were immediately arrested, while the authorities tried to understand what had happened. The strangest part was that it wasn't just the guards who were after them. The church people were also pursuing them. That was when the truth came to light. Not only the crime of betrayal, but also the secret the convent had been hiding. Few knew that inside the convent lay the mummified body of a nun. Its state of preservation was inexplicable, her skin intact, her expression serene. The nuns who once lived there had long since departed, but she remained untouched, considered a saint. The Vatican, it was said, was investigating her beatification. The most astonishing part, however, was what she held in her hands, a golden cross encrusted with precious stones, a gift from her family when she took her vows. It was said that she came from a noble lineage, an extremely wealthy family. The story of her holiness endured, but along with it, the detail of the golden cross reached the wrong ears. Two thieves from a neighboring village became fascinated by the legend and decided that the nuns' riches would be theirs. They spent days watching the convent's movements. Like in many small villages of that time, security was minimal. In the dead of night, they slipped into the convent and searched for the reliquary. After checking several corridors, they finally found the glass coffin where the saintly nun rested. With trembling hands, they lifted the lid and snatched the cross. They had expected something enormous, covered in diamonds, but found a modest piece, valuable but not ostentatious. Even so, they did not hesitate. The gold in their hands seemed to glow in the dark, a cursed treasure. But they didn't escape unnoticed. They were pursued by guards and villagers, but managed to flee through the underbrush, deciding to hide in the hills. They knew they couldn't return home anytime soon. They needed a plan. They found shelter in a small cave they were familiar with. Its entrance was narrow, but enough to keep them protected from the cold and from those who were hunting them. They didn't light a fire. Fear of being found still consumed them. Then, when they finally managed to relax, something startled them awake in the middle of the night. They opened their eyes and saw it. At the cave entrance, silhouetted against the pale moonlight, stood a figure watching them. A nun. Her dark habit rippled as if woven from shadows. She stood still for a few seconds. Then she raised her arms, and before they could react, she dropped a massive boulder. The impact reverberated through the cave. Their only exit was blocked. The two men screamed in terror. They tried to move the rock with all their strength. They clawed at the surface with their nails and fingers, leaving streaks of blood on the cold stone. But it would not budge. Trapped in the darkness, they screamed until their voices failed. They begged for forgiveness, but no one heard them, or so they thought. After all, someone did hear. At dawn, two merchants, who had taken a different route to avoid the news about the thieves, stopped when they noticed fresh marks along the trail. They approached and heard muffled groans coming from the cave. With the help of ropes and a horse, they managed to move the stone. The thieves emerged from the hole as if they had crawled out of hell itself. They said nothing. They ran straight to the village, desperate, clutching the golden cross. They returned it without hesitation. But it was too late. The nun's body had vanished, and with it the stories of her miracles disappeared as well. The church covered up the case. The village felt shame, not just for the theft, but for having sentenced two men to death in a cave, even if they were thieves. But among the children, a legend was born. They said that if you stayed out too late at night, the nun would appear on your path, always seeking revenge, always watching those who let themselves be consumed by greed. So be careful on your way home tonight. If you stay out too late, she might be waiting. Account 4. Hello, friends. I want to share with you a story I experienced as a child alongside some catechism classmates. I was 10 years old at the time, one of the oldest in the group. Today, at 28, I still remember every detail as if it were yesterday. And every time I tell this story, a shiver runs down my spine, as if the terror of those days never truly left me. Reliving those moments feels like returning to that place, feeling the same fear, having the same nightmares. Anyway, this is my story. My mother used to take me to catechism every Saturday at a small church in the colony where we lived. It was close to home, and sometimes I would walk there with neighbor friends. The church was at the edge of the colony, and behind it there was nothing but wilderness. Behind the church stood a small, old building that had once served as a convent. Now it was abandoned. No one went inside. The tomb doors were always locked, and the priests and nuns forbade us from getting too close. Our classes were held outdoors in the churchyard, which we enjoyed because, like any child, we hated the feeling of being trapped inside a classroom. On my first day, I was accompanied by a friend who lived next door to my house. Before classes started, it was tradition to sing inside the church and say a few prayers. Everything seemed normal until something unsettled me. Behind the altar, where the priest celebrated Mass, there was a door. That was where I saw her for the first time, a nun. She watched me with an eerily cold stare, motionless. Her face was deathly pale, almost lifeless, and her eyes, two dark abysses, locked onto me without blinking. I felt uneasy. I told my friend, who turned and saw her too. "Maybe she's the head of the nuns," he said, not giving it much importance. I didn't reply, but we both agreed on one thing. She was terrifying. Class started, and we moved to the courtyard with our catechist, a young and very kind nun whom we all liked. She always made us color, which made the lessons more fun. It was while we were drawing that my friend nudged me. "Look, turn around." We followed his gaze toward the building behind the church, and there she was, the same nun standing there watching us. Her pale face and black eyes were unmistakable. She didn't move, she didn't blink. A chill ran down my spine. I told my friend we shouldn't look at her. Maybe if we ignored her presence, she would stop staring at us. For a while we kept our eyes on our drawings, but when I looked again, she was gone. During our 30-minute break, while the other kids ate, we used the time to play soccer. I was the goalkeeper, my back turned to the church and the abandoned building. Then someone kicked the ball too hard, and it rolled into the restricted area. It was my job to fetch it. I didn't want to, but I knew that if I refused, everyone would laugh at me. Kids can be cruel at that age. I swallowed my fear and went. The farther I walked from my classmates, the more anxious I became. I searched for the ball on the ground but couldn't find it. And then, for no reason at all, I lifted my head. The blood froze in my veins. In the window of the abandoned building inside, she was watching me. She was holding the ball in her hands. I stood frozen. My heart pounded so fast it felt like it would burst from my chest. I wanted to run, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. Then I heard my friend calling me from afar. His voice snapped me out of it. I turned to him as he approached, asking why I was taking so long. When I looked back at the window, she was gone. I didn't tell the truth. I simply said I couldn't find the ball. He helped me look, but as I already knew, we never found it. We returned to the others. The boy who owned the ball was upset, saying his mother would scold him if he came home without it. But before we could continue searching, the church bell rang. The break was over. At the end of class, we tried looking for the ball again. That's when the cleaning lady saw us. "What are you doing there? That place is off limits," she said, eyeing us sternly. We explained about the ball. "Oh, children," she muttered. "I don't think you'll find it. You'd better go home and never come back here." We never asked what she meant by that. We just left. The next morning, I went to Mass with my mother. During the service, the nuns sat on some benches near the altar. But behind the altar, that same door, there she was, the black-eyed nun watching me. This time, I was sure. I was the only one who could see her. I told my mother. She looked. There was no one there. I was scolded for talking during Mass. After the service, I went to the food stalls, where I met my classmates. We were chatting when an older boy asked, "Have you ever seen the nun that always watches us from behind?" Silence fell over us. Many answered yes. Surprise washed over me and my friend. We thought we were the only ones. The boy then made a suggestion. "Let's go there this afternoon. We'll look for the ball and see what's inside the building." Everyone agreed. It sounded like an adventure. In the end, only 4 of us actually went. The church was already closed when we arrived. The sky was cloudy and the wind howled. We crossed the yard in silence. The older boy suggested we split up. My friend and I went one way. Suddenly, we heard screams. We ran toward the other 2. They were terrified. "There was a nun watching us," one of them stammered. "She spoke." The other added, "Her teeth, they were sharpened." The boy who had lost the ball gave up looking for it. We were ready to leave, but the older boy challenged us. Let's try to get inside. The doors were locked, the windows had bars. Then we heard footsteps, leaves crunching beside the building, and a wail, a woman's voice crying. We were naive, we followed the sound, and that's when I saw it. By the large tree, a woman stood watching us. She smiled, and on the ground, at her feet, a lost ball. We ran without looking back. That night I cried, begging my mother never to take me to church again. She didn't listen. The next Saturday, we returned to catechism, and that's when the janitor approached us. You saw her, didn't you? He knew. He told us never to return to that place alone. And then he told us the story of Rafaela, the nun who never wanted to be a nun, who died at that tree, and who never left. Account 5. My name is Dolores, and I am now 59 years old, but the story I am about to tell happened long ago, when I was still a student at a preparatory school. My parents traveled constantly for work and had difficulty leaving me alone for long periods. So they decided that the best solution was to send me to a Catholic boarding school in the city of Campe. At first it was supposed to be only for a few months. The convent was strict. Some nuns were kind, but others, like the mother, superior, were figures no one wanted to challenge. All the students feared her because her rigor was unquestionable, and the punishments she imposed were severe. At that time, things were different. Our parents trusted these methods and taught us to obey without question. Even under such strict rules, I had a close group of friends. There were 4 of us, and among us, Tanya was the boldest. Sometimes she convinced us to sneak out of the dormitory late at night and drink in the back courtyard of the convent, where there was a building of abandoned dormitories. No one ventured there. The place was dark, distant, and had a strange atmosphere. But we went anyway. The 4 of us were there because of obligations and were tired of being trapped all the time. So, when Tanya's older sister smuggled alcohol during visits, we waited for nightfall and sneaked into that place, eager for a bit of freedom. One night, we were sitting outside the abandoned building, laughing and drinking. Everything seemed normal until Sophia, one of my friends, suddenly fell silent. She fixed her gaze on one of the windows of the building and asked, "Girls, do you see that?" We all turned at the same time, and there she was, a nun. She watched us with wide eyes and a disproportionate grin, so large that it seemed unnatural, as if she were about to laugh, but her expression was one of fury. A cold shiver ran down our spines. We bolted in terror, leaving the bottles and any trace of our escapade behind. We spent the night convinced we would be punished the next day, but to our surprise, no one reprimanded us. No warning was given, no nun scolded us. It was as if nothing had happened. That made us uneasy. We knew what we had done was serious, leaving the dormitory at night and drinking alcohol. The Mother Superior would never let something like that go unnoticed. But days passed, and nothing happened. Until one night Tanya convinced us to go again, this time without alcohol, just to relax. That night felt different. The air was heavier. The place was quieter than usual. We tried to ignore it, but then we heard a sound, a faint knock, coming from inside the abandoned building. We wanted to leave immediately, but Tanya, in her usual daring spirit, decided to investigate. The translation continues with the chilling conclusion of the event. Account 6. The rain beat insistently against the windows, while the wind found a small gap, producing a thin, eerie whistle. The sound was almost hypnotic, pulling our attention away from Sister Martina's monotonous voice. It was a grey afternoon, late September, and the approaching storm made the boarding school even gloomier than usual. The last class of the day had already ended, but for some reason we were taken from our dormitories and gathered into a single room. There was something strange in the air, something beyond the heavy clouds covering the sky and the storm that loomed. A bad feeling lingered over us, an invisible, suffocating presence. The nuns who led us were different. Their faces were somber, their expressions tense. Some wept quietly, while others murmured prayers as more students arrived, occupying what little space was left. There weren't enough chairs for everyone, and we had to squeeze together on the benches, sharing the cramped space with girls from other classes. Outside, in the corridor, nuns huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. Some seemed disturbed, restless. Then an unexpected sound filled the air. The tower bells began to ring. It was a long, mournful toll, different from usual. The room fell silent. The windows trembled with the thunder that followed, and a chill ran down my spine. What was happening? Would the storm force us to spend the night there? Was the boarding school being evacuated? My classmates whispered theories, but none seemed satisfactory. Then Sister Cecilia entered the room. Out of habit and respect, we all stood up at the sight of her and, in unison, greeted, "Good afternoon, Sister Cecilia." She walked slowly toward the desk, while Sister Martina, unlike the rest of us, remained seated. She seemed distant, staring out at the courtyard, where the heavy rain fell like a thick, grey veil. Her eyes turned toward us, and her expression twisted in irritation. Without any apparent reason, she began shouting. She scolded us, listing punishments. None of us understood why. Outside, the storm roared, while the bells continued to echo in the distance. Sister Cecilia passed silently behind Martina and sat in a wooden chair, holding a rosary between her fingers. She stroked the beads nervously, as if trying to find comfort in prayer. The room remained tense until more nuns entered. They walked slowly, their heads bowed. There was deep mourning in their faces. Then they made the announcement. Sister Cecilia had passed away a few hours earlier. A heavy silence fell over the room. We looked at each other, bewildered. Sister Cecilia, dead, but how? If she was right there, sitting in the chair. Before any of us could speak, a loud crash split the air. Lightning struck so close that we felt the ground tremble. The lights flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed us whole. Panic spread among some of the students. We could hear muffled cries, tense breathing, nervous murmurs. The nuns asked us to pray for Sister Cecilia's soul. Someone brought lanterns, and one was placed on the table. Its weak light cast shadows across the walls. That's when we noticed. The chair where Sister Cecilia had been sitting was now empty. None of us dared to say a word. No nun mentioned what we had witnessed. The only one who knew and who saw the same as us was Sister Martina, but she never admitted it. She never spoke of that night. Instead, she punished us harshly for 2 weeks. Why? Perhaps because she knew the truth, perhaps because she was afraid, or perhaps because even now, Sister Cecilia is still there, sitting in that chair, waiting to be noticed again.